Before we begin, please could I ask all of those who aren't speaking to mute their microphones and also to keep your cameras off unless you're presenting. And as the message on the screen has just popped up, this event is being recorded. So thanks everybody for joining today's Midlands Branch Pipeline Industries Guild presentation. It's really good to see so many people joining us, and this promises to be another really interesting webinar. We've got three really fantastic speakers for you today who are going to be talking about the environmental issues and solutions that are facing the pipeline operators and utility companies all across the UK. Firstly, we're going to be hearing from Henrietta Stock, who's the Energy and Carbon Manager at SES Water. She's going to be talking to us about the UK water industry's net zero carbon route map and its implications for water companies, customers and regulators. Then we're going to hear from Alex Watts, who's a Senior Surveyor at Fish German, and she's going to be talking to us about the forthcoming Environment Bill and the Green Offset project. And then finally, we're going to be hearing from Jenny Salt, who's a Senior Associate Planner at Fish German, who's going to be talking to us about how to include Biodiversity Net Gain at the planning stage of projects and giving us an insight into her experience of the requirements so far. At the end of the presentations, there'll be plenty of time for questions, but please do feel free to ask throughout using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. We'll put a little note down there in a moment so you can see where to put them. And so without further ado, Henrietta, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Antonia. I shall just share my screen, which hopefully will work okay. Hopefully everyone can see my slide. Is that working, Antonia?
Yes, that's perfect.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name's Henrietta, and I'm an energy engineer and work for SES Water as Energy and Carbon Manager. And as Antonia said, I'm going to give a really brief overview of the water sector's net zero carbon route map. And for background, SES Water, if you're not familiar with us, we're a small water-only company. We serve approximately 750,000 customers across parts of Surrey, South London, Kent and West Sussex. Okay, so as one of England's water and wastewater companies, we're part of the water sector's net zero carbon public interest commitment. There were a number of public interest commitments made by the water industry collectively in 2019, of which the net zero carbon is one of those, and the target is for 2030. And since then, there's been a kind of technical working group made up of representatives of the different water companies working with the consultants, Mott MacDonald and Ricardo, developing a route map really to show how we can achieve that commitment. And that was published in November last year. It's worth saying that that commitment is focused very much on operational emissions from the water and wastewater companies. And the route map's quite an interesting piece because it does also cover the work that's been done by the industry to date to reduce emissions and plots a business as usual trajectory of what we think would happen to emissions if we didn't have this specific commitment and didn't sort of put in place measures to go above and beyond what we're currently doing and what's happening at a national level with decarbonisation of electricity, for example, as well. And then the route map goes on to talk about different pathways to achieve net zero. And essentially it sets out three different pathways to achieve that for the sector. One of those is demand-led. So that's very much around working with customers and reducing demand for water. There's one that's technology-led, and that focuses very much on innovations in the industry, particularly around wastewater process emissions, things like renewable generation and electric vehicles as well. And then the third pathway is called removal-led. That's focused very much around opportunities for sequestration, such as tree planting and peatland restoration and so on. And then, of course, there's a kind of combined pathway, which brings together aspects of those other three and shows how close we can get to achieving the net zero carbon target for 2030. But there are still a number of challenges that that route map highlights as well. First of all, it is a sector level commitment. So it's not individual companies committing to be net zero for 2030, although many have separately made that commitment. It is for the sector as a whole to be net zero by 2030. That has its own challenges in terms of how we implement that, measure it, monitor it, and regulate it. I think one of the other big challenges is that our customers and people using water in homes and businesses have to be part of the solution to achieve it. And the other key challenge is that we won't get fully to zero. There are lots of process emissions, for example, that we can't eliminate. So there will be aspects of sequestration or offsetting that are required in 2030 in order to meet that target. And as part of publishing the route map in November last year, there was also a kind of summary for policymakers and stakeholders published, which again makes really interesting reading. It does highlight some key messages around, water being critical to climate change mitigation in the UK, that the 2030 target we've set is very ambitious. Although we've made significant progress already, we can't work in isolation as a water industry. We have to involve our customers and stakeholders and regulators. It estimates that we can save an additional 10 million tonnes of carbon by targeting 2030 as opposed to 2050, which is of course the UK government's target currently. It also estimates that we need to invest around £2 to £4 billion to achieve this commitment. And that's quite significant because we've already had our price review for the first half of this 10-year window, essentially, that we've got. We only have PR24 remaining for the second half. So that's a lot of investment we need to somehow find in order to achieve that commitment. And regulation is a really important part of us achieving that commitment as well. We will need new regulatory frameworks to help keep down the costs of some of the abatement activities that we will need to do. And that summary also highlights a number of commitments from the water industry that companies will make around how we will lead, how companies will have their own individual plans, and how we will protect our customers in achieving this target. It also sets out a number of recommendations to stakeholders, how the government need to have an economy-wide strategy for decarbonisation rather than individual industries acting alone, and that there is that role for regulation to support decarbonisation as well. So what does it mean for individual water companies? Well, I will briefly talk you through how SES Water are translating that industry level route map down into a company level route map as one example. For us, we believe that a demand-led pathway is the most affordable and also resilient way to try and achieve net zero carbon by 2030. So we'll be working very closely with our customers and communities to try and achieve our ambitions. And obviously also drawing on some existing technologies such as renewable generation and electric vehicles. And we've identified basically 5 areas of strategic focus that we'll be concentrating on in order to achieve the 2030 commitment. And the first of those is renewables. So we already, like many water companies, purchase 100% renewable electricity, and we're looking to increase the amount that we generate on our own land. So we're setting ambitions around how much of our electricity demand we meet with our on-site renewables, and we're also inviting the community to be part of funding and owning and profiting from those solar installations. The next area is around energy efficiency. Obviously, we're always looking for ways to operate our sites more efficiently. It saves us money. And I think the key focus for us will be around data and how we can use data more to increasingly kind of support our decision making in this area. It's an area where we haven't had good data in the past. So we're setting ambitions here around not just reducing the kilowatt hours that we use, but also how many of our assets are sub-metered and can help inform the operating decisions that we're making. The third area is around water efficiency. So here we're looking very holistically at reducing the total amount of water that we abstract each year, as that's the best for the environment, not just looking at leakage of treated water and customer consumption, although obviously they are really important parts of it as well. And we have ambitions in this area around our smart meter rollout, so rolling out more smart meters, and potentially longer term looking at how we can use those to have smart tariffs, a bit like you get in the energy industry, where you might pay a different amount depending when you use that utility, or potentially even how much you use in total. So we're seeing the smart meters as a real enabler for encouraging change with our customers. We're also really keen in the water efficiency area to look at alternative water supplies, so rainwater and grey water. You know, ultimately, we might be looking at, as a water company, can we provide different products of different qualities for different uses? I think in the shorter term, what we're talking about is working with developers in our area who are maybe putting in new housing estates or blocks of flats and so on, and looking at how we can reduce or waive the charges for connecting those new properties to our network if those developments include rain or grey water supply for the residents as well. So working closely with those developers to try and reduce the total amount of treated water that those new customers are going to be taking. The next aspect is around fleet. We've already switched about 10% of our fleet to electric vehicles, and we're expecting that to be 25% by the end of this year. Our ambition is that all of our vans and cars, smaller vehicles, will be electric by 2025. And the HGVs and some of the larger vehicles that are still in development and coming to market will be electric by 2030. But we also want to reduce the total miles that our staff travel. And so we're looking at some of the innovations we're putting in place to support that. So things like smart meters, the way in which we can monitor the network and leakage remotely should all help us to actually reduce the number of journeys people are needing to make in the first place. And then our fifth area is on fossil fuels. And here our ambition is just to completely eliminate our use of fossil fuels by 2030. Firstly, by reducing our use of gas, which we use for heating and keeping chemicals at the right temperature. And we're replacing gas boilers with electric heating and air source heat pumps on our sites currently. And then the more challenging piece for us will be around getting rid of our diesel for diesel backup generation, which we need to have for resilience purposes in case of power supply issues. So looking at alternatives for that, which might be around vegetable oil alternatives, or potentially even batteries further down the line if we can find something to provide that same level of resilience that we need. So that's how it sort of translates into 5 key areas of activity for us. And it's worth mentioning 2 other areas as well, which are kind of beyond this commitment, but still important. One of those is around carbon sequestration. For us, that's more likely to be around capturing carbon in the soil rather than tree planting or peatland restoration, just because of our particular geographical area. In any case, all of those aspects, although really important and we will be investing in, are not going to deliver results for 2030. So they're not going to be part of this specific commitment, even though they are things that we will progress with over the next 10 years. And the other really big one that's not included in this commitment, but again is a really important area of focus for the whole water industry, is around the embedded emissions or emissions in the things that we construct and design. And that's an area where we're probably a few years further behind where we are on operational emissions. We still need to sort of agree as an industry a consistent and robust way in which we're measuring and reporting and targeting those embodied emissions. But that's something, again, that's very much going on at the moment, and will be a really key part of reducing our emissions in total. So that's kind of my whistle-stop tour for you of the water sector's net zero carbon route map. Obviously, there will be time for questions at the end of everyone's presentations. And if you want to get in touch with me after today, by all means, my email is on the screen now. And I will hand back to Antonia, I think, who is going to hand over to someone else.
Thank you, Henrietta. Has anybody got any questions? I had one quick one. What do you think will be the biggest challenges or obstacles to you meeting your 2030 targets, Henrietta?
There are a number of challenges. I mean, I think there's a really big question around how we make sure that the emissions that we can't eliminate, so particularly process emissions, how we sort of offset those or sequester carbon to offset those, and how we make sure that that's robust and reliable. I think that's going to be a really big challenge for us. And actually, I think the other really big challenge is the piece around the embodied carbon emissions, which strictly isn't part of this target, but is still, an equivalent piece of work. It's equivalent in importance to reducing our total carbon footprint. And I think that's going to be really challenging to get on top of and work with our suppliers to really understand what those carbon emissions are.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Next up, we've got Alex Watts, who's going to talk to us about the Environment Bill and the Green Offset Project. So if you want to start sharing, Alex.
Ellie, you can see my screen.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon, everyone. As Antonio said, I'm Alex Watts and I'm a chartered surveyor working in the rural sector at Fisher German. So today I'm going to firstly introduce the term natural capital. I'll then discuss the Environment Bill, talking about policy background, what Biodiversity Net Gain is and how it will impact future developments. Finally, I'll be talking about our new initiative, the Green Offset, a platform which Fisher German has developed, which seeks to connect those who are looking for areas to site natural capital schemes with those who have land available. So what is natural capital? Natural capital is defined as elements of nature that directly or indirectly produce value to people, including ecosystems, species, fresh water, land, minerals, the air, and oceans. By assigning a value to the benefits of natural capital, they can more easily be incorporated into decision-making processes, which will in turn lead to better management of our natural assets. Natural capital defines an approach taken to measure and account for the value that the environment provides to the people and economy. This has been overlooked by traditional approaches to economic assessment, and the UK government's 25-year environmental plan embeds the concept of natural capital at the heart of the government's policy making. So the Environment Bill was reintroduced on the 30th of January 2020 following the general election, and is expected to pass in autumn of this year. The primary legislation is thought to deliver many of the objectives of the government's 25-year environmental strategy, with the secondary legislation to then detail more implementation. It will introduce three key areas: legally binding targets for improvement in priority areas of environment, a duty for the establishment of local nature recovery strategies, and the principle of biodiversity net gain to be applied by the planning system. So biodiversity net gain requirements aim to address the decline in biodiversity seen in the UK by requiring that development leaves biodiversity in a measurably better condition than before the development took place. Whilst biodiversity is currently a consideration in the planning system, the Environment Bill proposes introducing a mandatory requirement for development to show a net gain in biodiversity of at least 10% as part of any planning consent. It is expected to apply to all scales of development where habitat is impacted, with the exception of development consent orders. Biodiversity net gain will need to be determined by a planning authority by approval of a biodiversity gain plan submitted by the developer before the development can begin. Net gain requires developers to go beyond simply conserving biodiversity on site and instead requires them to increase biodiversity as a result of the development. The net gain must be delivered for at least 30 years and potentially in perpetuity, as it is likely to develop into a requirement for broader environmental net gain. Whilst it is not mandate, biodiversity net gain is already being applied in planning. Applied to planning in some local authorities, for example, Warwickshire, Oxfordshire, Cambridgeshire, Hampshire, and others. So biodiversity net gain, what does it mean for developers? Developers are expected to take a hierarchical approach to the delivery of net gain by firstly avoiding biodiversity loss through site selection, secondly minimising any biodiversity or habitat loss by careful planning and consideration, thirdly, mitigate any loss by delivering habitat improvement on-site to enhance biodiversity. Where net gain can't be achieved on-site, then developers can demonstrate a net gain through off-site habitat compensation measures in the local area, otherwise known as biodiversity offsetting. Where local offsetting cannot be arranged, then biodiversity credits can be purchased from the government. This will be a fallback option where local offsets could not be secured. It will require input from ecologists in assessing baseline habitat, development losses, and net gain requirements. This will all add to the cost of development for all scales of development that's progressed with. So how will Biodiversity Net Gain offer opportunities to those who have surplus land available? Where a net gain cannot be delivered on site, Biodiversity Net Gain will require developers to secure biodiversity offsets within the local area. This offers the potential for landowners to gain a long-term income stream for managing land for biodiversity benefit. This can be delivered via a developer contribution to the local authority, or by agreeing management plans with landowners directly to enhance existing habitats or to create new habitat. This offers an opportunity for those who have surplus land available for the provision of long-term biodiversity offsetting. The type and scale of land required for offsetting will depend on the development and the habitat which needs to be compensated. The offset is likely to be delivered through conservation covenants, which will pass through the land and will be for at least 30 years in order to deliver the specific habitat. So Biodiversity Net Gain, how is it measured? The Natural England Biodiversity Metric provides a tool for measuring biodiversity value. This enables assessment and measurement of biodiversity on a habitat basis. It calculates biodiversity in terms of habitat units, allowing different types of habitat to be assessed for their quality and significance to provide a comparable output. The habitat value is ascertained by a calculation of the following: habitat area multiplied by condition and distinctiveness of the habitat, multiplied by ecological connectivity and strategic importance. The metric gives significance to not only just the scale and quality of habitat, but also where it is in relation to other habitat sites. This means that two otherwise identical areas of land could have different habitat values depending on where the habitat is in relation to its surrounding area. Land with a high level of connectivity could deliver more habitat units per area. The best opportunities is for land with an existing low biodiversity baseline and with few other opportunities or low current use value, for example, an area of unproductive arable land which does not have any other hope for alternative development. Local nature recovery strategies will have a role in identifying priority areas for habitat creation. So in summary, much is yet to be determined. Ultimately, we will have to wait for the Environment Bill and they will to pass, which is, like I said, hopefully going to be in August this year. Biodiversity Net Gain is clearly going to have a significant impact on both development, but also offer some opportunities for those who have land available. Close attention will need to be paid to the outcome of the Environment Bill and secondary legislation, but also local nature recovery strategies at a local level. Undoubtedly, offsetting agreements are long-term commitments and need careful consideration, and a multidisciplinary approach and shared learning is required. So Biodiversity Net Gain is not the only market for ecosystem services. Carbon offset is an area of fervent interest in agriculture as a potential new income source for landowners. There are also a number of nutrient management schemes in development, with particular focus on reducing the amount of nitrate and phosphate entering into sensitive watercourses. With these new markets for ecosystem services in mind, Fisher German has developed the Green Offset, which is an innovative new platform which aims to help develop provision of land for these emerging markets. The Green Offset website platform provides a simple means of linking those who have surplus land available and will consider natural capital schemes, be that habitat creation, carbon or nutrient management, with those seekers who will need a site to deliver environmental outcomes. We've developed the Green Offset, which seeks to pair together those who have surplus land available, known as offset providers, with any party who is seeking an offset, whether that be corporate companies looking to sequester carbon, or a developer looking to offset biodiversity, or a utility company looking to also achieve their own natural capital targets. There is currently no other system on the market which offers this type of service, and with our existing client base, we have recognised a huge business opportunity to launch a platform which can act as a matching service to willing individuals. Anyone with land can simply register it to show that they'd be willing to consider it being utilised for offsetting purposes. This process is completely free of charge, and the land is made visible anonymously to anyone seeking an offset, who can then inquire directly through the platform. The platform has been designed to be as simple as possible for people to register their land with no binding commitments once it's registered. If a seeker makes an inquiry about the landowner will be notified and has the choice as to whether they can take the introduction forward or decline it at the inquiry stage. For seekers, the platform will provide visibility of land potentially available for offsetting and will take the legwork out of identifying land for habitat delivery, something which could otherwise be a very time-consuming process. It provides a simple route to make the introduction to enter into further negotiation. The aim of the Green Offset is to provide a simple platform to enable useful conversations around delivery of ecosystem services for the private market to take place. It is hoped that it will help drive these new markets forward and help all parties involved to begin assessing and exploring these opportunities, and over time deliver some clarity as to what is a complex new topic for land management. Thank you all very much for listening, and I welcome any questions.
Thank you, Alex. It's really interesting. So I think we've had one question so far from Martin Berry about whether Biodiversity Net Gain will apply to permitted development rights, such as water company projects. I don't know if you want to pick that up, but I think Jenny's presentation afterwards might answer that. So we can always carry that one across.
Yeah, probably best to pick up with Jenny's presentation.
Okay. Just in a quick one then, how are landowners responding so far since the launch? Are they overall keen?
Yeah, really keen. I think ultimately the buzzwords commits you to nothing and is free obviously helps. We've already got over 15,000 hectares on there. And ultimately, because it commits them to nothing, all it does is sort of make them aware of any opportunities which might be out there. And because natural capital schemes and the vast array of them are all unknown at the moment, it's a good opportunity for landowners to just be made aware of any opportunities, even if they don't, commit to then delivering any of them.
Brilliant. It'll be interesting to see how it progresses.
Yeah. If anyone wants any more information, just let me know.
Perfect. So I think then we'll move on to Jenny, who's going to be talking us through how to include Biodiversity Net Gain at the planning stage of projects. And she's going to be giving us an insight into her experience with the requirements so far.
Thank you very much, Antonia. I'll just arrange for my screen to be shared. Sorry, hopefully you can see that okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
Excellent. So thank you very much. As Antonia's mentioned, I'm Jenny Salt, a Senior Associate Town Planner at Fisher German, so work alongside Alex, but in a different department. And today I'll be running through the changes that will be made to the planning process once the Environment Bill's been adopted, reflecting on where we are now with regards to Biodiversity Net Gain delivery, and then I'll go on to explain how Biodiversity Net Gain is delivered through the planning process, the challenges we are currently facing in the transition, and recommendations for taking infrastructure projects forward with the planning process in mind. So I'm just changing slides, got too many things open. So Alex has helpfully set out the background of the upcoming Environment Bill and the need to secure Biodiversity Net Gain through the planning process once it's been adopted. As part of any planning application submission, there's the compulsory 10% increase in Biodiversity Net Gain that needs to be provided. And these proposals will be secured through the planning process, ensuring that they're maintained for at least 30 years. One thing to note is that the mandatory Biodiversity Net Gain requirements do not apply to permitted development works. So hopefully that answers Martin's question from earlier, but also doesn't apply to NSIP projects, which are commonly known as National Infrastructure Projects. So where are we now? As part of the planning process, we've got national planning policy and local planning policy, which set out the rules for development proposals. Planning applications are determined in line with these policy documents. It's the National Planning Policy Framework, which is also known as the NPPF, which is the current national planning policy document for England. And within this, it encourages biodiversity net gain at the moment as part of development proposals, but there's no formal requirement to deliver it through the planning process. Although there's some cases that we're aware of where individual local planning authorities have set their own local requirements, and these are implemented through the local planning policies. So as an example, we've got Warwickshire County Council that we often deal with us being based in the Midlands, where they have a mandatory requirement for all development proposals to provide biodiversity net gain as part of any proposal. They don't specify a particular percentage of biodiversity net gain in Warwickshire, but instead it's anything above 0%. So you have to do some form of betterment as part of your planning application. They have their own biodiversity net gain calculator at Warwickshire that they use to establish the baseline unit value and also the biodiversity net gain unit value, rather than what's expected with the Environment Bill is it will be the government's calculator that everybody uses the same across the board. But interestingly, though, we are finding that our clients are being really proactive and providing their own biodiversity net gain as part of their projects, setting their own internal targets ahead of the Environment Bill adoption. These targets can be in the region of 15% biodiversity net gain and tend to be deliverable across a whole project rather than just limited to the elements of the scheme which require planning permission, which the Environment Bill will enforce. So providing biodiversity net gain through the planning process, whenever biodiversity net gain needs to be demonstrated as part of a planning application, whether that be now to local authorities like Warwickshire County Council or in the future to all authorities once the Environment Bill's been adopted, an ecologist needs to be part of the project team to help to pull together the necessary documentation. So the ecologist will establish the pre-development baseline biodiversity unit value of a development site and then prepare a biodiversity net gain proposals document which sets out the required level of biodiversity enhancement as part of a scheme. This needs to demonstrate that the post-development biodiversity value of the development is greater than the pre-development biodiversity value by at least 10%. And this would be submitted as part of a planning application submission. The pre-development baseline biodiversity unit value and the biodiversity net gain unit value will be calculated using the government's biodiversity calculator. This tool assigns a numerical value to each habitat type on a development site, and that's based on its size, its type, its quality, its age, or its ecological characteristics. So it's quite a complex, it's easy to use, but a complex system that can add a numerical value to habitats. As an example, if you had a site that was calculated as having 100 units of pre-development baseline unit value, you'd need to provide 110 to achieve that 10% net gain once the Environment Bill has been adopted. This can be provided either within the development site, off-site, and whether that be within ownership that's owned by the applicant, or it could be third-party land, or it could be a combination of both. And if the local or planning authority has a site already identified for biodiversity net gain, then there's always the option to do a commuted sum through a Section 106 legal agreement through the planning process to provide that financial money to the council for them to spend on a separate scheme. The biodiversity net gain proposals put forward as part of a planning application submission will be secured by planning condition or a legal agreement when a decision is issued. And this ensures that the applicant maintains this enhancement for at least 30 years following the completion of the works on the development site. So it's a long-term commitment. In terms of challenges we're experiencing at the moment, there's inconsistencies between local planning authorities and client targets at the moment, which means that every project has its own set of unique requirements, which can cause delay to projects because we're needing to understand the unique requirements and educate the project teams in this new subject matter. And as I mentioned earlier, the NPPF already encourages development proposals to incorporate biodiversity improvement into new development, although the mandatory requirement for 10% will be challenging for some schemes to provide due to lack of land ownership. So in this scenario, alternative methods like the Section 106 agreement with the council, where you provide the financial contribution for planting elsewhere, or offsetting via a third party will be needed. The need to involve a third party or to introduce the financial contributions can lead to additional costs and time on a project programme. The green offsetting tool that Alex talked about assists with this process and makes it so much more efficient for a project team to identify appropriate landowners that can help to provide that offsetting. So project teams need to allow sufficient time in their programme just to negotiate the biodiversity offsetting proposals with any willing landowners. For the Biodiversity Net Gain proposals to be appropriate for the planning application submission, they need to be delivered on land close to where the planning application has been submitted. So it might be that there's sufficient land within the applicant's ownership, such as the wider operational site, if new development only takes up a proportion of that. Although infrastructure providers will need to ensure that they're not sterilising land, which they may need in the future for new assets, for example. So as biodiversity net gain proposals need to remain in place for at least 30 years, there needs to be that strategic long-term view for sites in the applicant's ownership, just to ensure that future commitments can be met without having to buy additional land from third parties in the future and effectively being held to ransom because they need it for operational purposes. Where there's development sites close to local authority boundaries as well, biodiversity net gain proposals are likely to need to remain in the same local authority area as to where you've submitted your planning application, just to have weight through the planning application process, and because councils like to deal with things in their patch. But this will become clearer once the Environment Bill's been adopted as to whether, because everybody's adopting the same approach, whether there's flexibility over those boundaries or not. For simple schemes that take place at the moment, for example, installing a new kiosk on an existing operational site, no biodiversity net gain would need to be provided normally, unless you are within an authority area like Warwickshire County Council, where they have their local biodiversity net gain requirements. Although once the Environment Bill's been adopted, this 10% net gain needs to be provided despite the kiosk being installed on existing concrete hardstanding, for example, and no habitats being affected. We're finding this with Warwickshire at the moment, where we've got really simple planning applications that have become more complicated just because of the need to provide that biodiversity, anything above 0% that they're looking for currently. So this is going to potentially complicate what is a simple process at the moment for those really small schemes. So we need to get an ecologist on board early in a project to provide suitable biodiversity net gain proposals. We've got plenty of experience of this in Warwickshire at the moment. As say, we're having to designate areas of existing operational sites for things like wildflower mixes or tree planting as a way of compensating for development on site, and just to get it through the planning process. And that's even without the Environment Bill being adopted yet. In terms of recommendations going forward for any projects you might be involved with, I firstly recommend getting an ecologist brought on board early in the project. This is to calculate the biodiversity net gain baseline, and then later down the line, once the final design has been developed and effectively a design freeze is there, you can then get the ecologist to advise on appropriate biodiversity net gain solutions, pull together all the documentation required for any planning applications, and they can also inform how much land will actually need to be bought or found elsewhere to provide that offsetting. If any land does fall outside the developer's land ownership that's required for the biodiversity net gain solution, then I recommend involving a land agent like Alex to identify parcels of land that could be used. And this could involve land owned by landowners which are already affected by the scheme, adjacent landowners that know about the scheme but aren't directly impacted, or perhaps wider landowners in the area that can be identified using the green offsetting tool, for example. I'd also recommend having a planning consultant like myself involved in a project at an early stage, just to identify the requirements for planning permission and therefore the need for biodiversity net gain at the outset of the scheme. So if your client has internal targets for biodiversity net gain as well, they're probably across the whole project that it's a target for, rather than just the areas that need planning permission. But it's important that we identify which part of the schemes do need planning and which don't, so that the biodiversity net gain proposals can be tailored to satisfy the planning application process. For example, if you've got a pipeline scheme alongside works with within your existing operational sites at either end of the pipeline, then it might just be works within the operational sites that need planning permission and the pipeline's permitted development. But if you're looking to provide biodiversity net gain proposals for the entire scheme to meet the client's requirements in one of the operational sites, then you won't be able to demonstrate sufficient levels of biodiversity as part of the planning application for the other development site. So something to consider in terms of the location of that biodiversity net gain. Likewise, if the landowner affected by a pipeline has multiple hedgerows that need to be removed, and the team is intending to reinstate these and enhance those hedgerows as part of the client's targets for biodiversity net gains, this too wouldn't necessarily meet the planning permission requirements, particularly if you've got works going on at either operational site. So it's therefore best practice really to spread the biodiversity net gain across the project, location-wise across the whole scheme, but being sure that you are actually providing sufficient levels of biodiversity net gain local to where the planning permission is needed. This needs to be 10% of the habitats that are affected solely by the development that needs planning permission, rather than 10% of the whole scheme. So there's something to bear in mind, that it's very, very focused on just the planning submission as a single entity, but you'll have wider drivers that you're needing to deliver for clients. We've been involved in a few projects in Warwickshire, as I mentioned earlier, where they currently need biodiversity net gain requirements. And these sites have had a lot of new assets being proposed on existing operational sites, but they're only a single building or kiosk which require planning permission. So as I mentioned earlier, permitted development works is not subject to biodiversity net gain requirements. So in these instances, we've been able to limit the extent of biodiversity net gain proposals to just relate to the building that needs planning permission, rather than providing net gain for all of the development that's going on the whole entire site. This has meant that more land has been kept back on operational land for future operational assets, rather than taking up too much of the site for that biodiversity net gain. And finally, I recommend thinking holistically and long term across projects and the wider client aims. Whilst it's great that many of our clients are being really proactive and providing voluntary biodiversity schemes outside of the planning process, I encourage them not to provide all of the biodiversity net gain opportunities all in one go. This is just because whenever you submit a planning application, you're going to be expected to provide that 10% net gain for the development you're doing. So you'll need to make sure that there's land available to put forward these future schemes for biodiversity. And also, I guess if you overdeveloped sites, then it could lead to increased costs and risks in the future, as you'd need to buy additional land above and beyond what you might have done, just to provide the new assets, as I mentioned before. So it's just being really mindful as well that these biodiversity schemes are absolutely fantastic, but they last for 30 years. So it's thinking that long term and holistically. And that's just a whistle-stop tour of my involvement in Biodiversity Net Gain, but happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jenny. We've got one question so far from Keith Neary. Would that 10% of biodiversity net gain have a time window of, say, 5 to 7 years to deliver or grow?
So as part of a planning application, you would get consent for a landscaping scheme or a biodiversity enhancement scheme, and you would be usually expected to plant the trees or put in the wildflower mix or whatever it is your proposal is within the next available planting season following completion of the work. Currently, for planning applications, they tend to have landscaping schemes limited to only 5 years as a commitment, but in terms of going forward, it's 30 years. And if you wanted as a scheme to say that actually you've got the first 5 years, we're planting X, Y, Z, years 5 to 10 we're planting XYZ, that method statement or that plan will be conditioned as part of a planning application. So there's the opportunity to do a staggered phase across the 30 years rather than doing it all in one go if you wanted to. It's just whatever you say in the planning application goes.
Thank you, Jenny. And is it possible to have a look at the valuation tool?
The calculator. Is that?
I think that's probably what
I haven't got a copy of it, but there is, I believe there's a calculator available on well, there's a DEFRA calculator on the internet that some councils are using, not Warwickshire. As I say, Warwickshire have their own local biodiversity calculator, but there is a DEFRA calculator currently being used. But whether that's going to be the same or not come the adoption of the Environment Bill, I imagine there's going to be tweaks made to make it robust across the board. But yeah, if you give it a Google, there'll be a calculator out there that you can explore just to see what it's like. As I say, they tend to be that you have to put the baseline level in, so you categorize each type of development. So you've got a woodland, for example, that's really old, and you've got an ecologist out that's able to assess the quality of that woodland. They're able to there's a drop down list basically to choose the appropriate category from, and then you can punch in the size and the location and things like that, and it all comes out with a unit value. And then you've just got to do the same again for any proposals. So it's a bit of a trial and error in terms of finding a solution that works to get the 10% net gain that you need.
Thank you very much, Jenny.
Right.
I think that's all the questions that we've got on for you. But Henrietta, if it's okay, we've got one that came in for you after your presentation. It's from Paul Wallace. He says, as leakage levels are driven down for every water company, there will be more numerous smaller leaks to find. This will inevitably lead to more and more jobs to fix smaller leaks, leading to more operational carbon. Do you think the 2030 is a realistic target with this in mind?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the 2030 target is ambitious, regardless of anything else. It is going to be really challenging to meet it. Leakage is an important part of it. I mean, you're right that there is, some pretty strict targets on water companies already around driving leakage down. So we can assume that we're going to be doing that anyway. I think that the thing that comes into play here is some of the technology that's available. So, for example, a large number of smaller leaks occur in our customers' homes, and hopefully smart meters and the data from those will allow us to identify those, and the homeowner to identify those much more quickly and be able to address those themselves. And then I think, the same with leaks in the network. Hopefully the kind of network monitoring and data that we can get from the network will allow us to more intelligently sort of respond to and identify leaks, and potentially even predict them as well in advance of them happening. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us there to really be able to go much further, and it not necessarily to increase the number of people who are having to drive around trying to identify leaks. And we can use technology to actually reduce some of that operational carbon that otherwise would be there.
Brilliant. Thank you, Henrietta. So I think that's all the questions that we've had logged. So I think all that remains is for us to say thank you very much to all three of our speakers, Henrietta, Alex and Jenny, for three really fantastic presentations. I think it's been really good to learn a bit more about the move towards net zero and the Environment Bill and its implications. And thank you everybody for contributing some really good questions. Just say, sorry. So I think if there aren't any further questions, I think all that remains is just to say thank you very much on behalf of the Midlands Branch and the Pipeline Industries Guild. And if everybody's happy, we'll probably end it there.